The desert wind whispered through the ruins, carrying with it the scent of dust and forgotten centuries. Beneath the relentless sun, fragments of sandstone walls stood like broken teeth, their once proud hieroglyphs now eroded by time. Most passers-by would have dismissed these crumbling remains as just another relic among Egypt's countless tombs and temples. But for those who know where to look, these ruins speak, and their voice tells of a king who should have been remembered as one of Egypt's greatest war leaders, yet was instead erased from history. His name was carved away from monuments, his statues smashed, his story buried under the shifting sands. And yet the whispers remain. Our journey begins not in the height of Egypt's golden age but in one of its darkest hours, a time when the Nile's great kingdom was fractured, its rulers weak, its enemies bold. Scholars call this period the Second Intermediate Period, a chapter of Egyptian history marked by chaos, foreign occupation, and civil strife. The once mighty pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom had lost their grip on power. Rival dynasties squabbled over scraps of territory while opportunistic invaders pressed in from all sides. The Hyksos, a foreign people from the Levant, had seized control of the Delta, bringing with them new weapons and war tactics Egypt had never faced before. In the south, Nubian forces tested the borders, eager to exploit the chaos. Even the Nile, Egypt's eternal lifeline, could no longer guarantee unity. It was into this storm of uncertainty that our forgotten pharaoh was born. His early life was one of survival in a palace where trust was scarce and betrayal was common. His father, a minor ruler in Upper Egypt, held only a fragment of the once great kingdom, a land constantly threatened by both internal conspiracies and foreign armies. The boy would have grown up hearing the clash of weapons from the palace walls, seeing prisoners marched in chains, and learning early that in Egypt's fractured world, mercy was a luxury few could afford. But if the boy was shaped by fear, he was also forged by ambition. The palace scribes whispered that he spent hours studying the old battle records, tales of great kings like Senusret III and Mentuhotep II who had once crushed rebellions and reunited the two lands. At night, he listened to veterans speak of chariot charges, siegecraft, and the discipline of hardened soldiers. In his eyes, Egypt's weakness was not inevitable, it was the result of leaders who had forgotten how to lead. The political climate was a web of shifting loyalties. Nomarchs, powerful provincial governors, played both sides, pledging allegiance to whichever faction seemed strongest that week. Trade routes were raided by desert tribes, temples were plundered for their gold, and famine loomed in the wake of disrupted harvests. In such times, a ruler had to be more than a figurehead, he had to be a warrior, a strategist, and a manipulator of men. But this young heir was underestimated by all, too young, too quiet, too untested. That underestimation would become his greatest weapon. When his father died unexpectedly, some say poisoned by a rival faction, the young prince ascended to the throne in a court that expected him to be a puppet. They believed he would bend to the will of the elder ministers, keep the army small, and avoid provoking the foreign powers holding Egypt's throat. Instead, his coronation marked the beginning of a silent revolution. The new pharaoh spoke little in council, but he watched everything, cataloging the ambitions and weaknesses of those around him. Behind the scenes, he began to cultivate a network of loyalists, men chosen not for their birth but for their skill and their loyalty to Egypt above all else. And beyond the palace walls, the situation grew even more dire. The Hyksos, emboldened by years of Egyptian disunity, sent emissaries to demand tribute. Their message was clear: submit or face destruction. To the south, Nubian warlords began building up forces near the border forts, their intentions unmistakable. Egypt's enemies believed the young king would yield without a fight, preserving his throne at the cost of Egypt's dignity. But deep within the royal residence, preparations had already begun. Smiths worked tirelessly to forge new weapons. Messengers rode under cover of night to recruit hardened mercenaries from desert tribes. Even the old war chariots left to rot in military storehouses were being restored to deadly perfection. In the shadows, the pharaoh was awakening Egypt's war machine. The common people, however, knew nothing of this, yet. To them, the new ruler was a quiet, scholarly figure, more interested in temple offerings than military matters. They did not see the private councils, the maps spread across the war table, the coded messages exchanged between loyal commanders. They did not yet understand that their king intended not just to defend Egypt, but to reclaim every inch of it. And so, as the sun dipped below the horizon one fateful evening, the young pharaoh stood upon the palace balcony, looking north toward the lands held by the Hyksos. In the fading light, the desert seemed endless, its silence broken only by the distant cry of a hawk. Somewhere beyond that horizon, enemy banners fluttered in the wind, daring him to act. His court still believed they could tame him. His enemies believed they could intimidate him. History believed it could forget him. They were all wrong. The sands of Egypt were about to run red. The Nile shimmered under the morning sun, but its tranquil surface masked a nation on the brink of collapse. Egypt's borders were bleeding, not just from the swords of foreign invaders but from the treachery of its own nobility. In the north, the Hyksos fortified their strongholds in the delta, their foreign war chariots dominating open battlefields. In the south, Nubian forces pressed along the Nile's cataracts, probing Egypt's weakened defenses. Even the heartland was restless. Governors and nobles conspired in secret chambers, weighing the benefits of loyalty against the allure of aligning with the strongest power of the moment. For the newly crowned pharaoh, this was the reality he inherited: a throne without stability, a crown without unquestioned authority, and an army that was more symbol than force. Every advisor urged caution. They spoke of sending lavish tributes to the Hyksos, of securing treaties with Nubian warlords, of buying peace through gold rather than blood. Outwardly, the young ruler nodded, appearing to absorb their counsel. Inwardly, he counted the days until their influence would wane. But the road to reclaiming Egypt began not with open war but with survival in a palace riddled with hidden daggers. It was said that in the first month of his reign, at least 3 attempts were made to poison him. A cup of wine at a feast went untouched after a hawk, sacred to Horus, swooped down through the banquet hall, scattering guests and overturning the vessel. Days later, a trusted servant vanished, only for his body to be found floating in the palace's ornamental pool, silenced before he could speak of what he knew. The young king responded not with paranoia but with strategy. He began removing long-standing officials, replacing them with those whose loyalty was to him alone, often men of humble origin, overlooked by the aristocracy but bound by gratitude. These new appointees became the backbone of his inner circle, ensuring that the pharaoh's orders would be carried out without interference. He understood what many kings before him had forgotten: that power was not held by the throne itself, but by the people who enforced its will. Outside the palace, he moved cautiously but deliberately. He toured Egypt's southern garrisons, presenting himself not as a distant monarch but as a leader who ate, marched, and slept among his soldiers. Veterans of the old Middle Kingdom campaigns, long retired to obscurity, were summoned to court and given new commissions. The pharaoh listened to their stories, memorizing their battlefield lessons. In return, they swore oaths to follow him into whatever war awaited. Economically, the situation was desperate. The Hyksos controlled key trade routes through the delta, siphoning off wealth before it reached the heartland. To counter this, the pharaoh initiated covert trade through desert caravan paths, avoiding the river routes patrolled by enemy scouts. Grain was stockpiled in hidden depots, bronze weapons smuggled in from allies beyond Egypt's borders, and skilled craftsmen given royal protection to work on military equipment in secret. And yet, for all his preparations, the pharaoh knew that open conflict would not come until the right spark ignited it. That spark arrived in the form of insult. A Hyksos envoy arrived in Thebes, bringing with him demands that were more humiliation than diplomacy. Not only did they insist on yearly tribute, they required the young king to cede control of a key southern fortress, effectively inviting the Hyksos into the heart of Upper Egypt. The message was clear: accept subjugation or face annihilation. In the council chamber, his ministers urged compliance. "We are not ready," they insisted. "The gods will understand if we bend for a season so that Egypt may endure." But the pharaoh's face was cold stone. To yield now, he knew, would not save Egypt, it would finish the work of those who had been dismantling it piece by piece. That night, he stood on the palace terrace, gazing at the darkened waters of the Nile. The river had been Egypt's lifeblood for thousands of years, but it had also been its battlefield. Countless kings had risen and fallen along its banks, and now it was his turn to be tested. He thought of the old stories he had studied as a boy, of pharaohs who had faced impossible odds and triumphed not because they were ready, but because they had no choice. The time for silence was ending. Messengers departed under cover of darkness, bearing sealed orders to his most trusted commanders. Smiths worked through the night. Scouts slipped beyond the borders. The war drum had not yet sounded in the open, but in the shadows, Egypt was already preparing to strike back. The orders had been sent, and with them began the quiet rebirth of Egypt's military might. In the deep hours of night, the forges glowed like embers in the desert, hammer blows ringing through the darkness as blacksmiths shaped bronze into the tools of war. Chariot wheels turned in dusty courtyards as carpenters refitted old frames and trained apprentices in the art of precision joinery. What had once been relics of past campaigns were now becoming instruments of vengeance. The pharaoh understood that reclaiming Egypt would require more than courage, it would require transformation. The Hyksos had introduced advanced composite bows capable of piercing armor at distances Egypt's traditional archers could not match. They commanded swift, maneuverable chariots, each crewed by a driver and an archer working in deadly coordination. If Egypt's army was to meet them on equal terms, it had to evolve. To this end, the pharaoh commissioned the construction of Egypt's own improved chariot corps. Skilled engineers studied captured Hyksos models, refining them with lighter frames made from local acacia and tamarisk wood, designed for speed across the desert sands. Horse breeders were instructed to pair the strongest stock, ensuring mounts that could endure the grueling pace of war. For the first time in generations, military workshops operated at full capacity, not to defend what remained, but to prepare for an offensive that would take the fight north. Training began in secret. Veteran captains drilled fresh recruits in new formations, staggered chariot lines for rapid flanking, shield walls reinforced with spear units, and coordinated infantry archer advances to counter enemy mobility. The pharaoh himself appeared at training fields, not as a distant overseer but as a commander willing to take the reins of a chariot, his linen kilt whipping in the wind as he raced across the sands. The sight of their king in the dust and sweat of the practice ground sparked a pride Egypt had not felt in decades. Logistics, too, became a priority. The army could not survive on glory alone. The pharaoh ordered the creation of concealed supply depots along the Nile, stocked with grain, dried fish, and amphorae of beer. Pottery workshops were repurposed to produce uniform water jars, ensuring that soldiers could march longer without fear of thirst. River barges were retrofitted for rapid troop transport, while camel caravans were organized to carry supplies across desert routes beyond enemy patrols. All of this was done in the shadow of secrecy. Publicly, the pharaoh continued to send token gifts to the Hyksos, gold trinkets, exotic oils, maintaining the illusion of submission. In reality, each shipment served as a cover for intelligence gathering. Couriers returning from the Delta brought maps, troop counts, and descriptions of enemy fortifications. Every scrap of information was inked onto papyrus scrolls and locked away in the royal archives. By the year's end, the transformation was undeniable to those within the inner circle. The army was no longer a fractured relic of past glory, it was a blade honed and ready. The men spoke of their king not just as a ruler, but as a general who would lead them to reclaim Egypt's honor. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, the pharaoh stood over a map etched into the sand. With the point of his khopesh, he traced a line north, from Thebes through the Nile Valley and into the Hyksos-held delta. His captains watched in silence as he drove the blade's tip into the sand where the enemy's capital lay. The message was clear. The time for forging was over. The time for striking had come. The dawn broke red over the Nile, the rising sun casting long shadows over the assembled army. Rows of spearmen stood like a living wall, their shields glinting in the light. Behind them, archers checked their composite bows, the sinew strings taut and deadly. To the flanks, chariots waited, horses snorting clouds of steam into the cool morning air. At the center of it all stood the pharaoh, his armor inlaid with gold, his khopesh resting against his thigh. Today, the years of preparation would be tested. Today, Egypt would strike. The enemy was not far. Scouts reported that the Hyksos army, confident from years of domination, had marched south to crush this rebellion before it could grow. They came with their famed chariots, their archers ready to rain death from afar, and their foreign mercenaries eager for plunder. What they did not know was that this pharaoh had studied them, every strength, every flaw, and had prepared a battlefield that would turn their advantage into a trap. The field of battle lay near a narrow bend in the Nile, where fertile ground met desert ridge. On the eastern flank, the pharaoh's engineers had dug concealed trenches, covering them with reeds and sand. To the west, a low rise offered the perfect position for archers, its slope angled to give maximum range without exposing them to counter-fire. The plan was simple but dangerous: lure the Hyksos chariots into the center, break their momentum, and then strike from all sides. As the enemy advanced, the ground shook with the thunder of hooves and the rumble of wheels. The Hyksos front line surged forward, their archers unleashing the first deadly volley. Arrows hissed through the air, finding gaps in shields, felling men in the opening moments. But the Egyptian ranks held. The pharaoh rode along the front lines in his chariot, raising his khopesh high, his voice carrying over the din: "Hold! The gods stand with us today." The Hyksos, sensing weakness, pressed harder, their chariots driving into the center. And then, the trap was sprung. The leading chariot wheels struck the hidden trenches, snapping axles and sending horses tumbling. Chaos rippled through their formation as the Egyptian archers on the rise loosed a storm of arrows into the disarray. The once perfect lines of the Hyksos army fractured, confusion spreading like fire through dry reeds. That was the moment the pharaoh had been waiting for. He signaled the flanks, and Egypt's chariot corps surged forward, wheels cutting deep into the sand as they raced to encircle the enemy. In the center, the infantry surged, spear points glinting as they crashed into the stalled chariots. The sound was deafening, the clash of bronze, the screams of men and horses, the shouts of captains rallying their soldiers. The pharaoh himself charged into the fray, his chariot weaving between fallen enemies. He swung his khopesh in a wide arc, striking down a Hyksos officer who had rallied a pocket of resistance. His presence was electric. Wherever he rode, his men fought harder, their voices rising in a war cry that echoed across the battlefield. The Hyksos tried to rally, pulling their remaining chariots to the rear to regroup, but by then it was too late. The Egyptians pressed from all sides, their archers cutting down fleeing soldiers, their infantry driving deep into the heart of the enemy's formation. By midday, the Nile's bend had become a killing ground. The once proud Hyksos force lay broken, their banners trampled in the dirt, their survivors scattering in retreat. When the battle ended, the field was littered with the wreckage of war, splintered chariots, shattered shields, and the bodies of the fallen. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, blood, and victory. The pharaoh stood upon the ridge, surveying the scene. He had not just won a battle, he had shattered the illusion of Hyksos invincibility. Word of the victory would spread like wildfire through Egypt, igniting hope in hearts that had long resigned themselves to foreign domination. But even as the soldiers celebrated, the pharaoh knew this was only the beginning. The Hyksos would regroup, and their revenge would be swift. Yet for the first time in years, Egypt stood tall, not as a divided land, but as a nation ready to reclaim its destiny. As the sun dipped low over the Nile that evening, the pharaoh ordered the enemy's captured banners to be burned. The flames danced in the wind, a beacon visible for miles, sending a message to friend and foe alike: Egypt would no longer bow. The victory at the Nile's bend sent shockwaves through Egypt. In Thebes, temple priests proclaimed the pharaoh's triumph as the will of the gods. Merchants reopened trade routes once thought lost. Farmers returned to their fields with renewed hope. For the first time in years, the air in Egypt carried something it had not known in a generation: confidence. But in the halls of power, victory bred something else entirely: fear. The nobles and ministers who had once whispered that the young king was inexperienced now whispered something far more dangerous: that he was becoming too powerful. The battle had proven not only his military skill but his ability to inspire loyalty among soldiers and commoners alike. And in a court where influence was currency, such loyalty was a threat to those who had built their wealth on Egypt's weakness. The first signs of this new war came quietly. A grain caravan bound for the southern garrisons was mysteriously waylaid, its supplies vanishing without trace. A trusted general fell ill after a banquet, never to rise again. In council meetings, ministers who had once praised the pharaoh's decisiveness now urged restraint, pressing for negotiations with the Hyksos instead of pursuing the advantage. The pharaoh recognized these for what they were, the opening moves of a different kind of battle. Here, there were no chariots or trenches, only poisoned cups and veiled words. He tightened his inner circle further, granting key posts to those who had fought beside him on the battlefield. The temples received generous offerings, ensuring that the priesthood would stand as a moral shield against accusations from his rivals. Yet the struggle to maintain unity was exhausting. In the north, the Hyksos nursed their wounds, sending spies into Egypt to gather intelligence and stir dissent. Some of the nobles, ever pragmatic, began quietly negotiating with them, hoping to secure their own lands in case of a Hyksos resurgence. The pharaoh countered with calculated displays of strength. He ordered victory monuments erected in the capital, inscribed not only with the story of the battle but with the names of the common soldiers who had fought. It was a subtle but powerful move, elevating the loyalty of the people above the influence of the court. Still, he could feel the sands shifting beneath him. Battles fought in the open could be won with strategy and courage, but battles fought in the shadows were far less certain. And in these shadows, the seeds of betrayal were already taking root. As he stood before his palace one evening, the sound of the city quiet around him, the pharaoh understood the cruel truth: crushing Egypt's enemies beyond its borders had been the easy part. Now he would have to survive the enemies within. Years later, the story of the pharaoh's victory still echoed along the Nile, but his name began to fade from official records. The monuments he had built were quietly defaced, his cartouche chiseled away. Scribes once eager to record his deeds now omitted him from the royal lists. To the casual observer, it was as if he had never ruled at all. Why this erasure? Some say it was the work of jealous successors, fearful of being compared to a warrior king whose courage they could never match. Others believe it was part of a calculated political rewriting, an attempt to present Egypt's liberation as the work of another dynasty, one more favorable to those in power. Whatever the reason, the sands of history closed over him, burying his reign in silence. And yet, history has a way of resisting oblivion. Centuries later, archaeologists uncovering the ruins of Thebes found fragments of reliefs showing a king in a chariot, striking down foreign foes. Inscriptions, half erased, still carried the faint outlines of his name. Slowly, piece by piece, his story emerged from the desert, as if Egypt itself refused to forget the man who had defended it. Today, the pharaoh's tale stands as both triumph and warning. He proved that courage and strategy could restore a broken nation, but also that power, no matter how great, can be buried beneath the weight of politics. In the shifting sands of Egypt, even kings can vanish, unless we choose to remember.